Good day. I am Clarissa. Today we will talk about economics, politics, and the American prospect. This is chapter 6 from the book Exploring Social Change by Charles and Kevin. Economy and political system. These two are important institutional arenas of large-scale change we should understand. And in this video, we will tell you why. First, let's talk about growth in scale and the centralization of economic power. Until the 1980s, there has been a rapid growth of huge corporations and corporate empires in the United States. There are at least two ways in which big businesses and their owners acquired excessive power in the American economy. They first built its authority through the acquisition of company stocks and securities. Second, they grew powerful by controlling the market. Certain product markets are dominated by a select few large companies. Manufacturing firms have historically had more market power than retail firms, but retail firms have also grown more consolidated. Now, let's proceed to small firms, entrepreneur, and the bimodal economy. Centralized firms are still with us. As late as the early 2000s, research suggested that the trends toward greater size, scale, and centralization were declining.
The expansion of small businesses and the resurgence of entrepreneurship have been the economic news since the 1980s. Small businesses and business owners have always existed, but their resurgence reflects both historical truth and contemporary societal trends. The causes of this are numerous and intricate, but at the very least, they include the giants' poor performance, especially during recessions like the one from 2008 to 2009.
Small businesses collectively hold around half of the assets in the economy. In general, there are now three different types of small businesses.
Here are the three different types of small businesses: the satellite businesses that subcontract with larger ones. Second, loyal opposition businesses that compete with larger businesses in their own markets. And lastly, free agents or diverse groups of businesses that emerge in uncontested market spaces. Small businesses are more active in markets. Large-scale organization and bureaucratization are challenging, and the services they deliver are probably still labor-intensive. They compete in marketplaces that are uncertain and where profits frequently change drastically from year to year, in contrast to the giants. Small firms are indeed very important to the economy for other reasons. They are the major source of employment and the creation of new jobs. Actually, only 30% of all workers work for the very largest industrial, financial, and service firms. Firms with a small number of employees are more common in retail and service than in manufacturing industries, and they make up between a third and a half of all U.S. companies. Small firms account for a significant proportion of American economic productivity. For instance, in 2015, only about 3% of American exporters had 500 or more employees. In fact, Bill Gates of Microsoft Corporation and Steve Jobs of Apple Computer both started in garage-sized firms and created huge, successful enterprises. But before you get too enthusiastic about the virtues of small, you should note that business failures and unstable employment are more common among small than large firms.
U-turn or dialectic, the changing forms and interaction of big and small. In spite of the recent explosion in the number of small businesses and entrepreneurship, large-scale economic structures have not really declined. Instead, through variety of historical forms that allowed for the persistence and emergence of small-scale economic structure, large-scale economic structures have endured and evolved. There have been five distinct definitions and historical manifestations of economic concentration in the United States. These five are expansion in the market, multidivisional firm mergers, conglomerate mergers, deconglomeration, and strategic alliances.
Now, let us proceed to the discussion of five distinct definitions and historical manifestations of economic concentration in the United States. First, the oldest scale of growth in America is market expansion. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 20th century, businesses used a variety of tactics to drive out rivals in order to consolidate control over entire markets for specific goods. Second, pioneered in the 1920s, the multidivisional firm mergers allowed a company to produce and market a variety of related products through separate divisions. Third, the 1970s were dominated by conglomerate mergers. They included a corporate growth strategy that involved acquiring businesses in unrelated market segments and product lines, giving rise to the firm as portfolio corporate practice model. Fourth, by the 1990s, the conglomeration was a common practice due to mounting evidence that first, massive conglomerates were not very profitable and competitive. Second, their component subsidiaries were frequently worth more than valued separately than the conglomerate as a whole. And lastly, the fifth one, in the 1990s, strategic alliances. That is, transient network coalitions between smaller, more specialized firms became increasingly common. Corporations are being rethought as voluntary and transient, dense patches in networks among economic free agents or joint ventures or enterprise webs in these open networks. Let us now proceed to the topic entering the global market economy. American businesses have expanded their operations and investments internationally since the 1970s as a result of the opening of sales offices and acquisitions of subsidiaries abroad, investments in goods and businesses located abroad, contracts with foreign suppliers for specialized parts and labor, and joint ventures with businesses from other countries. Going shopping and reading the labels of the items you buy will give you an idea of this growing globalization. Even brands with American, Japanese, or Chinese labels are likely to use foreign engineering and components. So, clearly, the United States function in the world market economy is not to supply a lot of routine work that is typically cheaper to be done elsewhere. Consequently, factory workers and their unions' fortunes are deteriorating. There is little doubt that worries about lost jobs and economic opportunities linked directly or indirectly to globalization were a major factor in Donald Trump's ascent to the position of U.S. presidential candidate in 2016 election. Industrialized nations like the United States offer funding, knowledge, and creativity in organization of high-value goods and services. Workers who can offer these services due to their training and experience will see the greatest growth in their income and opportunities. The issue is that these professions currently only make up about 20% of the labor force, and it is unclear how the majority of American workers will benefit from globalization.
Prior to 1929, limited government in America gave way to provide for national defense, police and fire protection, guaranteed legal contracts, and one cannot forget that corruption runs deep as lots of pork barrel benefits were created for the powerful groups. The Great Depression of 1930s and the post-war period throughout the 70s made the government functions grow exponentially as they had to create social reform. Building permits from expanding your own homes, license for job occupations, where and how many fish you can catch, when and where to drink alcohol, and many more regulations were set by the government. Labeled as social spending, the government spending has increased from 48% to 68% from 1970 to 2015. Most of the spending were not welfare for the poor, but social security, Medicare, and other benefits that is targeted for the not officially poor. The government seemed to be much better at keeping people from being poor rather than making the poor unpoor. Everybody knows that the government spends more money than it used to. An example is the spending amount that drastically changed in the average of 25 years. 310 billion in 1960, 960 billion in 1990, and 1.6 trillion in 2015. The federal budget deficit of 290 billion in 1992 turned into a budget surplus in 1998, but returned to budget deficit after September 11, 2001. The 2008 to 2009 economic recession helped push the budget deficit to approximately 1.4 billion, but with the economic recovery, the federal deficit shrunk to a mere 585 billion in 2016 to 2017. The 1950s deficit, although much smaller, was proportionally larger in relation to the size of the supporting economy than the deficit is today. Then, we were still paying the bills from borrowing to fight in World War II. GDP measures the value of all domestically produced goods and services, and is a much more accurate measure of national economic productivity than gross national product, which includes the value of overseas investments. Our national debt is around 105% of GDP as of 2016. Looking at the national debt as about the same size as the productivity of the economy is like saying you have high consumer credit debt, but your income is about the same size as what you owe. Government borrowing, so the reasoning goes, soaks up money from lenders that could be invested in private economy. Economic conservatives argue that economic growth is promoted by less government spending and particularly less borrowing, thus leaving more money in the private economy. But the other side of the coin is that high government spending may stimulate economic growth as the government itself becomes a major purchaser of goods and services. Governments closest to home in literally thousands of unconnected states, county, municipal, and public educational agencies have grown more rapidly than the federal government. Federal employment has grown modestly since 1950, relative to the larger growth of state employees and the mushrooming number of local government employees. In fact, federal employees make up a declining percentage of the total U.S. workforce, falling steadily from 3.8% in 1970 to 1.5% in 2015. Besides expenditure and taxes, the United States has a significantly more decentralized federal structure of governance than most other industrial democracies. Canada is probably the standout example of a more decentralized structure because Canadian provinces have many responsibilities and control over their budgets than do American states, as well as more power in relation to the national government in Ottawa. Next, to be discussed by Christine Aban is the topic of American ambivalence reversing the growth of governments to political action committees and other forms of political mobilization.
American ambivalence.
So first, what is ambivalence? Ambivalence is the feeling of being uncertain. So let's go back to the topic. American ambivalence is most Americans dislike growing governments and suspect them of incompetence or worse. They resent their intrusiveness, coastlines, and apparent inefficiency. They particularly resent the federal government, even if its actual role is not well understood, and rather than going away, that sensibility has grown over the past 30 years. And according to the writer, Americans are ambivalent about the expansion of governments. They argue that most government expenditures do not go to those defined as undeserving. Large states with regulatory powers seems necessary to maintain public order and civility. Even though costly and inefficient, they are often important problem solvers.
The changing basis of political mobilization.
All states depend more heavily on broad popular support for legitimacy in the modern world. Political parties aggregate and balance diverse and conflicting popular demands. American political parties are not so much ideological groups as loose coalitions defined by common economic interests as well as social and cultural characteristics.
Decline in effectiveness of political parties.
Voters are more fickle and less predictable in the party loyalties. Political scientists have speculated about the development of a relatively partyless electoral process. Americans are often turned off by a political campaign themselves, and voter turnout is lower than in most other industrial democracies. Voter turnout for U.S. presidential election has declined from 54% in 2000 to 55% in 2016. According to the Bipartisan Policy Center, political reforms and new technologies in electoral campaigns have played a role in the decline of political parties. These include secret ballots and increased split ticket voting. They led to a shift from label-intensive politics to one where candidates with money could tailor issues to voters. New rules that limit contributions from Political Action Committee (PACs) have produced networks of PACs that refer politicians to each other in search of campaign financing. Ticket splitting, rise of independent voters, political reforms, and introduction of new technologies have reduced historic forms of electoral fraud, corruption, and political cronyism. Reforms have also reduced the power of responsiveness of political parties as organizations. These reforms make voting less exciting, harder to figure out, and more dependent on individual rather than collective knowledge. The 2016 election produced a result that is puzzling to average citizens. Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote but lost the overall popular vote by close to 3 million votes. The 2004 election was a bit more decisive, but the decisive electoral votes came down to one state. It is Ohio.
Political action committees and other forms of political mobilization.
Political parties have declined as the popular base of political mobilization. The importance of single-issued political groups has increased. PACs are more important than parties as a source of campaign money. In 2015 to 2016, they spent collectively over $2.7 billion in lobbying, campaign contribution, and litigation. Political action committees, or PACs, are special interest groups that spend the vast share of money influencing politics. They can replicate the function of parties because they make no pretense of promoting broader public interests. The clout of PACs is still heavily weighted towards business interests. But as the number of PACs has increased, the ability of anyone to influence the system has declined. As parties and electoral process decline, other forms of political mobilization have emerged. Some believe that political power needs to be moved away from Washington, D.C. and dispersed throughout the country. Others suggest that internet voting and direct referenda are ways of avoiding the maze of organized interest groups, but each of these solutions presents further problems of their own.
On the last part of Chapter 6, we will tackle about the change, problems, and American prospects. This implies the problems and involving issues for public policy now and in the future, such as changing inequality, wealth, and living standards. The most delicate, pervasive, and important changes taking place in America, which is the gradual redistribution of America's economic resources. Let's take a look at the timeline of the changes in American economy. In short, economic inequality declined that period. But in 1970s, this process has undergone a pervasive and fundamental reversal because these figures relate to the disposable family income, which is the wealth is becoming even more evenly distributed since those at the bottom possess only their disposable income, while those near to the top own the most property and corporate bonds and securities. There are three kinds of understanding of the driving forces of the growing income inequality. First, family demography and culture. Second, the transformation of the economy, work, and policy. And last, government policies that explicitly favor investment and finance capital over earnings and transfer payments. Related to the rise in income inequality is the growing middle class squeeze. American public policy thinking about the problems has involved three things. First, privatize government regulations and taxes. Second, involves economic nationalism. And third, human capital. Even American attitudes towards government powerful enough to do these things, it would be difficult to reproduce those institutional patterns. Here's the important point. Among industrial democracies, there are two kinds of political economic policies emerging in the contemporary world. First is the Anglo-American model, and European model. Changing democracy in America, the legacy of September 11, 2001. The week of September 11, 2001.
So, to sum it all up, the economy and the political system are two of the most crucial institutional contexts for significant change that you should comprehend. Though you might not be particularly interested in politics or economics, both of these forces are interested in you. Yes, you heard it right, because they work together to shape the environment in which a large portion of your life is spent. They combine and regulate a large portion of what occurs in larger society as a whole. They determine who benefits and who loses from change by having an impact on things like changes in wages, the availability of credit, the expansion and contraction of jobs and industries, taxes, the benefits. We have grown accustomed to the laws that establish our obligations to one another. To separate economics and politics, or if you prefer, power and money, would be somewhat artificial given how closely related they are. But since we can't examine everything at once, and because Americans in particular are accustomed to seeing politics and economics as distinct fields, we will nonetheless do so. In this article, we've covered some particularly significant implications of these changes for American issues, public policy, and future prospects after describing economic change and political change. Thank you.